Suspend my campaign for president effective today.
That was former Vice President as he made it official that he will drop his bid for the White House. He made this announcement during the Republican Jewish Coalition Summit that took place in Las Vegas. The former VP says he will continue to, quote, fight for conservative values, even though his campaign is ending. Pence also called on President Biden to not deliver any aid to Gaza until all hostages currently held by Hamas are freed.
JFK was an immensely popular president at home and abroad. He ushered in a new era of optimism and brought brilliant advisors into the White House. His younger brother, Robert Kennedy, had worked tirelessly whilst running JFK's presidential campaign and was keen to settle down and start his own law practice. But his father, Joe Sr., convinced him to become Attorney General. He was now the second most powerful man in the country and advised the president on all matters of domestic policy, national security, and foreign affairs.
We have to be prepared to discuss what kind of a government or what kind of a system, a political system, we would hope to see established in Vietnam, which would also be acceptable to the government of North Vietnam.
JFK's wife, Jacqueline, and his young children, Carolyn and John F. Jr., were adored throughout the country, even before he was elected.
Leaving the Georgetown Hospital in Washington, President-elect John Kennedy wheels out Mrs. Kennedy, while Nurse Luella Hennessy carries John F. Kennedy Jr. The wheelchair is strictly a hospital formality, as Mrs. Kennedy proved shortly afterwards. Showing no lingering effects of her cesarean operation, she is up on her feet before the Kennedys fly south for some rest and relaxation in Palm Beach, Florida.
Voted Wednesday to support a resolution doing so. The city mayor accused Israel of carrying out what he called a campaign of apartheid and collective punishment. The resolution calls Israel's actions a war crime. Council members argue that Israel is breaking international law by shutting off access to electricity, drinking water, food, and aid. While a local official criticized the resolution for failing to condemn the Hamas terrorist attacks. Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th, killing an estimated 1,400 people and injuring about 5,000, mostly civilians. The group also took some 220 hostages. The most sophisticated money laundering probe in Australian history. After a 14-month investigation, authorities charged 7 people with helping a Chinese crime group launder over $140 million in dirty money. Let's zoom in.
Palestine, the Gaza Strip, I should say. It's the ruling government. And in that scenario, it seems to be impossible to work out a long-term working relationship. So that's why there's argument saying Israel needs to take out Hamas. Not all of Palestinians, but get rid of the controlling leadership. Would be nice if that could be done peacefully, but that's not the way it's heading, it looks like.
And when it comes to this Israel-Hamas war, there is, of course, the kinetic element, but there's also the information war that seems to be happening. You have a book on disinformation. How do we navigate this, whether it's what we see on social media, the rise in AI?
Yeah, it's huge, and that really has been a tactic that Hamas, Hezbollah, other groups in the Middle East have really deployed, where we hear about bombing of the hospital. And, that there's horrible stuff going on. Then it turns out it probably wasn't Israel who bombed the hospital. It was probably a misfired rocket, in fact, from Hamas. That's an old technique that's been in play in the Middle East for my life, anyway. And what we have to do, soldiers and generals make decisions in a matter of minutes, if not seconds. Those of us at home who have a little more time to digest need to take that time to digest before we make rash decisions. We need to look and question information that comes, particularly when it comes from a partisan source. And that was true during World War II, certainly true during Vietnam, and it's true today. There will be depictions designed strictly to influence the populace, to say that they're the bad guys, not us. And you've got to double check those matters and probably give them a little time to percolate too, because a lot of times what seems to be the story one day has changed dramatically a week later.
We did see that in terms of this hospital blast reporting. Well, Ron Rychlak, thank you so much for your time.
Man never elected president. Jack isn't above acting like the average father to give his daughter a piggyback ride.
The new president was a publicist's dream for the White House. And the newsman of the day followed his every move.
Mr. Kennedy, the nation's leading touch football player, turning baseball pitcher. The ball goes farther than the ordinary presidential pitch. The meeting of
Iran and Russia afloat financially. China's purchasing massive amounts of Iranian oil on the black market, thereby enriching the mullahs. And Russia is selling China gas and much, much more. And that is bolstering Russia's war machine.
And he says that poses an even greater concern for the United States.
Now, lengthy conflicts, particularly between Russia and Ukraine, will ultimately benefit China because it will distract America and it will deplete our already dwindling Western weapons and ammunition stockpiles.
As for how severe that threat is,
the threat posed by the CCP requires our primary focus and attention right now. Our goal from a national security perspective vis-a-vis the CCP is very simple. We win and they lose.
To address that threat, DeSantis proposes an expansion of the U.S. Navy fleet with the additional pathway for 600 warships in the next 2 decades. He also said that if elected, he'll make it easier for Taiwan to purchase advanced weapons.
We cannot raise the white flag of surrender. We have time to get this right, but time is running out.
As the West looks to counter China's growing global influence, DeSantis said a strong West will require more American leadership.
More news from California. Governor Gavin Newsom visited the Great Wall of China on Thursday. This after talks with Chinese.
Despite a bitter election fight, the United States will unite and go forward.
One of Kennedy's first positive presidential acts was the creation of the Peace Corps. Through this program, American volunteers could help underdeveloped nations in areas such as education, farming, healthcare, and construction. Since 1961, over 200,000 Americans have joined the Peace Corps, serving in 139 countries.
I don't feel safe here at home anymore. My family doesn't feel safe anymore.
Masih Alinejad is an Iranian-American activist. She was forced to leave Iran for being critical of the regime, and she now lives in the U.S., where she fears for her life.
Iranian regime were plotting to kidnap me and take me from Brooklyn by a speedboat to a cargo ship bound for Venezuela and then to Iran. To you, maybe it's a scary movie, but to us, this is the reality. They did that to my colleague in France, and they executed him in Iran.
Alinejad said she's had to move over a dozen times under FBI supervision, and she believes the Iranian regime is responsible. Alinejad says the Biden administration's response has been inadequate because it isn't holding Iran accountable. She says these threats are national security threats.
The Iranian regime's threats to the homeland are real and are growing. They've sought to conduct cyber attacks on our state and local governments and private industry. They plotted to target and assassinate individuals inside the United States, including former Trump officials.
Congressman Mark Green says that a record number of illegal immigrants are entering the U.S. through the southern border. He's concerned about how Iran could take advantage of that and infiltrate the country to commit acts of terrorism. Former State Department official Nathan Sales believes Iran may have already done so.
Iranian-linked terrorists have been found in the United States. I mentioned Hezbollah, 128 Hezbollah operatives arrested over the years by the FBI. Within that population of however many millions or hundreds of thousands of known gotaways, we should not assume that they are all perfectly clean.
Sales says the Iranian regime hides behind proxies instead of doing things themselves. These proxies include terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militias. Witnesses at the hearing said Iran also uses criminal organizations, like the European crime syndicate that tried to kill Masih Alinejad, and the Mexican drug cartels that tried to kill John Bolton. Faye Porter, NTD News.
All this while Iran continues to develop its nuclear weapons program. How is sensitive technological information flowing to Iran, and what can the U.S. do to address the threat? We spoke with a retired special agent and diplomat and author of the book Switched On. Eric, Karen, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
With the Israel-Hamas war ongoing, there's been a lot of scrutiny of Iran possibly supporting the Hamas terrorist group. And now this comes after the recent Iran hostage swap, where we also unfroze $6 billion. Now, the U.S. administration is saying Iran can't access those funds due to current events. How do you see the Iran deal fitting in with this war in Israel?
Well, I think it's a travesty that we did this deal. Iran has declared war against Israel and the U.S. They're responsible for the deaths of dozens of U.S. soldiers in Iraq. And we should not be negotiating with a state sponsor of terror. It only emboldens them. And we see what they're doing today. They have proxies all around the Middle East. They have militias, some 19 militia groups all over the Middle East, targeting the U.S., targeting U.S. servicemen. We essentially are at war. They declared war against us, and we need to take the gloves off against Iran and start taking the threat seriously before it's too late.
And Eric, on the point of negotiations, the U.S. has celebrated the Americans we got back, but what about the Iranians we released? What do we know about them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it was a fair deal. I don't think Donald Trump would have settled for this deal because, we essentially gave to Iran international arms traffickers who were providing sensitive military technology for their WMD programs. That's weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, chemical, missile technology that is facing us, that we are the target of those WMD weapons in Israel. And so these individuals should not have been released. They should have been charged with espionage because they harmed the interests of the U.S. They were providing sensitive military technology to Iran. And we see today some of that technology is being used today against U.S. servicemen in drones, in missiles. We think about border security as just inbound. We need to think about border security as what's leaving America, destined for terrorist countries such as Iran.
And on the point of the technology,
He maintained that he wished to be buried in Massachusetts, but his family believed that since the brothers had been so close in life, they should be near each other in death.
Now belong to the widow, the 10 orphan children, and the unborn infant that will never know its great father.
While the history of the Kennedy family may often be overshadowed by grief and tragedy, it's important to acknowledge the positive influence they have had on the world in the past, and their continued influence on the world to this very day. Jean Ann Kennedy Smith is the last surviving child of Rose and Joseph Sr. She is an American diplomat and a former United States ambassador to Ireland. Jean is also the founder of Very Special Arts, a non-profit organization dedicated to creating a society where those with disabilities can engage with the arts. In 2011, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor.
When you are among the youngest of 9 children, you develop a strong sense of empathy. When those children are the Kennedys, you also develop a strong set of diplomatic skills just to be heard. Both traits helped Jean Kennedy Smith follow her siblings into public service. When her brother, President Kennedy, visited Ireland in 1963, he promised he'd be back in the springtime. 30 years later, it was left to Jean to return for him. As President Clinton's ambassador to Ireland, Jean was as vital as she was unconventional, helping brave men and women find the courage to see past the scars of violence and
test sites in recent years. This comes amid growing tension between these countries. What do these images reveal? Here's the take from Jeffrey Lewis, a professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. He told CNN that there are a lot of hints that suggest Russia, China, and the United States might resume nuclear testing. Here's a snapshot of a Russian nuclear test site located in the Arctic Ocean archipelago. Satellite images show different buildings under construction. Lewis said Russia had been digging new tunnels, which could be a sign that they're prepared to resume testing. This is a satellite image of the nuclear test site in Nevada. It shows an underground facility has been expanded from 2018 to 2023. Lewis added the U.S. has a policy of always being prepared to do a nuclear test on 6 months' notice. Now moving over to China, here's a nuclear test site in China's western Xinjiang. It shows new constructions built in recent years. Another satellite image shows new underground tunnels. In addition to nuclear test sites, China has been expanding its nuclear forces. Beijing has about 500 nuclear warheads as of May. Its nuclear stockpile has been growing faster than the Pentagon's projections.
China's top diplomat kicking off a 3-day visit to the U.S.
It's another milestone in that effort to keep their lines of communication open.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is the highest-ranking Chinese official to visit Washington in the last 5 years. He's reportedly set to meet with President Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan this week. It is the latest move by Washington and Beijing to keep high-level talks open amid growing tensions. Discussions will center on the Israel-Hamas war, the conflict in Ukraine, and the recent boat clash between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea. China has criticized Israel for its response and called for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Wang's visit is seen as paving the way for a meeting between Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping next month in San Francisco.
China's former premier Li Keqiang has died. Li was China's premier from 2013 to 2023. He was shuffled out recently by Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping. Chinese media report that Keqiang died of a heart attack.
What would happen if a ceasefire began in Gaza? Russia and China vetoed a U.S. effort on Wednesday for the UN to act on the Israel-Hamas war. The U.S. draft would have reaffirmed Israel's right to defend itself and approved humanitarian pauses to deliver aid to Gaza. Here's more.
China defended its veto Thursday of a drafted resolution at the UN Security Council. The U.S. proposed the draft. It defends Israel's right to self-defense, calls for a humanitarian pause to the war in Gaza, and demands that Iran stop exporting arms to militant groups. 10 countries said yes, 3 said no, and 2 chose not vote in the 15-member council on Wednesday. The resolution was not adopted because both Russia and China cast vetoes. The United Arab Emirates also voted against it. An additional vote was cast on a Russian-drafted resolution calling for a ceasefire. China and the United Arab Emirates were the only country to vote in favor of the draft. The U.S. and Britain opposed the measure. The White House warned against a ceasefire earlier this week.
We're going to continue to make sure Israel has the tools and the capabilities that they need to defend themselves. And as I think you've heard us say, a ceasefire right now really only benefits Hamas.
Kirby also expressed U.S. concerns about future attacks on American troops. At least 9 vetoes are needed for a resolution. Adopting it would also require no vetoes from the U.S., France, Britain, Russia, or China. Israel's ambassador to the UN called those rejected the U.S. draft oblivious to Israel's suffering, saying, quote, "How would Beijing respond if genocidal jihadists beheaded and murdered your babies?" China has never condemned Hamas's terrorist attack. The country also put pressure on Israel to stop bombing Gaza after Tel Aviv vowed to eradicate the terrorist group.
President Joe Biden serving.
Sadly, Joe Sr. suffered a stroke later that year. He was paralyzed and remained unable to speak for the last 8 years of his life. Following the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs invasion, JFK traveled to Vienna, Austria, for a summit with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Not only was the summit unsuccessful in its goal of building trust, but it also increased tensions between the two superpowers, particularly in discussions regarding the divided city of Berlin. During the summit, Khrushchev threatened to cut off Allied access to West Berlin. Kennedy was startled by Khrushchev's combative style and tone and was unsettled by the Soviet threat. The following year, the Russians started to build the Berlin Wall. Cold War tensions hit a new high the following year. An American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union on the island of Cuba.
Such as this one of a medium-range ballistic missile base, which documents the Soviet offensive buildup in Cuba.
President Kennedy did not want the Soviet Union and Cuba to know that he had discovered the missiles. He met in secret with his advisors for several days to discuss the problem. After many long and difficult meetings, and with Kennedy perhaps wiser from the Bay of Pigs invasion, he decided to place a naval blockade, or a ring of ships around Cuba.
Russian President Putin in Beijing. China declared its friendship with Russia had no limits. That friendship was partially linked to energy. They signed a number of agreements during the visit, including a new gas deal. Under it, Russia would supply over 350 billion cubic feet of gas per year to China via a new pipeline from Russia's Far East. The Ukraine war boosted energy cooperation between the two countries even further. China imported a record volume of Russian oil in the first half of this year, while the West reduced energy imports from Russia and sanctioned the country. The result? China, as the world's second largest economy, could stockpile cheaper oil. The two countries started their energy partnership about 10 years ago. In 2014, China and Russia signed a gas deal for $400 billion over 30 years, bringing them closer together as they look to counter the West. As for the Ukraine war, China has not condemned Russia's invasion so far. The U.S. believes China is willing to supply weapons to Moscow. Intelligence reports cite a leaked document as saying China planned to send military equipment to Russia disguised as civilian goods. Beijing denied the accusation. A string of
Soviets from bringing in more military supplies. He demanded the removal of the missiles already there and the destruction of the sites. President Kennedy spoke to the nation about the crisis in a televised address.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Comes from their power sector. The country still adds new coal plants every year. Newsom also signed a new climate-focused Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, to advance carbon neutrality and clean energy. The governor and his Chinese counterparts touched upon human rights issues, including Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. Another topic was the fentanyl crisis and China's role in precursor chemicals.
It's there were international Chinese mafia groups behind all this smuggling and this drug trafficking, all these issues.
Next month, world leaders are expected to meet at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, scheduled for San Francisco. David Lamb, NTD News, California.
investigating religious
persecution for the next presidential campaign. Although he had not formally announced that he would run, he seemed confident about his chances for re-election. The political issues of the day included Kennedy's support for the civil rights movement that had gathered momentum, but was met with passionate resistance in the South. Kennedy's brother Robert, as Attorney General, had launched an unprecedented war on organized crime, and the United States' involvement in Vietnam was a simmering problem that was heading towards full-scale war. He would have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. When he made this proposal, America had just 15 minutes of manned flight experience in space, but his vision of achieving big things ultimately led NASA to fulfilling his dream. Unfortunately, the administration's first brush with foreign affairs was a disaster. In the last year of the Eisenhower presidency, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, had equipped and trained a brigade of anti-communist Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously advised the new president that this force, once ashore, would spark a general uprising against the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. But the
Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated terrorist groups.
President Biden ordered the airstrikes. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin stated Iranian-backed attacks against U.S. forces are unacceptable and must stop.
A defense official says 2 F-16 fighter jets using precision munitions carried out the attack and that weapons and ammunition facilities were taken out.
A statement from the Pentagon said precision self-defense strikes are a response to recent attacks that spiked on October 17th. The U.S. is bolstering its presence in the Middle East as attacks on U.S. and coalition forces rise. The Pentagon says it's deploying roughly 900 American troops to protect U.S. forces and interests overseas.
The news coincides with the shipment of a terminal high-altitude area defense system and more Patriot missile batteries to the region.
The Pentagon says U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria were attacked 3 times yesterday. That brings the total within the last week up to 16 and 19 since the war in Israel began. 21 U.S. personnel reportedly sustained minor injuries.
Iran's foreign minister warned the UN yesterday if Israel does not stop its offensive, the U.S. will, in his words, not be spared from this fire.
And White House spokesperson John Kirby defended the U.S. stance on death tolls coming out of Gaza.
Kirby was asked why the State Department changed its approach when reporting numbers from the Gaza and Palestinian Ministry of Health. Watch.
We all obviously grieve with the families and loved ones who are affected by that, but the numbers are not reliable. They're just not reliable. And I don't need to tell you how to do your jobs, but if you're going to report casualty figures out of Gaza, I would frankly recommend you don't choose numbers put out by an organization that's run by a terrorist organization. What's harsh is the way Hamas is using people as human shields. What's harsh is taking a couple of hundred hostages and leaving families anxious, waiting and worrying to figure out where their loved ones are. So what's harsh is dropping in on a music festival and slaughtering a bunch of young people just trying to enjoy an afternoon. I could go on and on. That's what's harsh.
On that topic, 50 Christian and Jewish leaders have signed a letter that says Israel must do all that is needed to destroy Hamas. So we're bringing in Dr. Susan Michael, who organized and signed the letter, to hear more about her moral reasoning on that. She's also the USA Director of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. It's really good to see you. Now, first, I would like to hear what prompted you to organize this.
The fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity. An era to be characterized by achievement and by challenge. It is an era which calls for action and for the best efforts of all those who would test the unknown and the uncertain in every phase of human endeavor. It is a time for pathfinders and pioneers. I have come to Texas today to salute an outstanding group of pioneers. The man who manned the Brooks Air Force Base School of Aerospace Medicine and the Aerospace Medical Center.
First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy rarely accompanied her husband on political outings, but she was beside him during the 10-mile motorcade through the streets of downtown Dallas on November 22, sitting in a Lincoln convertible along with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife. The Kennedys waved at the large and enthusiastic crowds gathered along the parade route. As their vehicle passed the Texas School Book Depository building at 12:30 p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly fired 3 shots from the 6th floor, fatally wounding President Kennedy and seriously injuring Governor Connally.
That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head. The president's wife, Jackie Kennedy, was not hurt.